Hi and welcome back to the channel. For today's tutorial, I'll be sharing with you how I made this Basque Corset gown with Ruffle. So if it's your first time viewing my channel, please hit on the subscribe button. Don't forget to give this video a thumbs up, leave your comment at the comment section, and if you're a returning subscriber, thank you for always supporting my channel. So let's start. So here is the pattern paper that I'm working with. I've gone ahead to mark my shoulder to bust, my shoulder to under bust, and my shoulder to waistline. So after that, the next thing I'm going to mark is my shoulder divided by 2. So my shoulder divided by 2 is 7 inches, and I will mark. After marking that, I'm going to place my tape and I'm going to mark the standard neckline, which is 3 inches depth and 3 inches width, and I'll go ahead to mark. So after making this mark, the next thing is to take my French curve and I'm going to place and draw my neckline. After drawing my neckline, I'm going to come down by 1 inch from my shoulder line, and I'm going to place my ruler and I'll draw my shoulder slant or shoulder slope from this point. Next, I'm going to place my tape at the shoulder slope and I'm going to mark my chest line. To get your chest line is your bust divided by 6 plus 1.5 inches. After doing that, I'm going to place my ruler and I'm going to draw a straight line. After drawing the straight line, I'll place my ruler this way and I'm going to draw a straight line at this point. So whatever I have there, I'll be dividing it by 2 inches. 7 divided by 2, I have 3.5, and I'm going to go in by ½ inch. But before I draw that, I'm going to go ahead to measure my bust circumference divided by 4. So the reason why I'm doing this is for my armhole curve not to exceed my bust point. So after doing that, I'm just going to place my French curve and I'm going to draw my armhole curve. After drawing that, next is to draw my dart intake. So at the chest line, I'm going to place my tape and I'm going to mark my nipple to nipple divided by 2. I'll mark at my chest line, at my bust line, at my under bust, and down to my waistline. After drawing that, I'm going to place my ruler and I'm going to connect, drawing a straight line. Now I'm going to be marking 1 inch at my under bust, 1 inch at both sides of my under bust, and 1 inch at both sides of my waistline. Then I'm going to place my ruler and I'm going to connect, drawing a straight line at both sides of my pattern. So after drawing that, the next thing is to place my French curve touching my bust and my under bust, and I'm going to draw. So if you don't have a French curve, you can go ahead to use a freehand sketch to do this. I will also repeat this process for the other side of my pattern. So for my chest line, I'm going to be going up by 1.5 inches. So this is not a constant. You can go ahead and go up by 2 inches. So after making a mark at that point, I'm just going to go ahead to mark my nipple to nipple divided by 2, and I'm going to extend my line back to that point. So I'll go ahead and make that 1.5 inches mark more visible. Then I'll go ahead to extend my line back to that 1.5 inches. Next, I'll be taking my dart intake for the upper part. So what I'm going to do is to mark 1 inch at both sides also. So after marking that, I'm going to go ahead to come in by ½ inch at my chest line. So you can decide to go down by ½ inch also, but I just want to leave it at my chest line. So from there, what I'm going to do is to place this French curve. You can also use a ruler and I'll connect to my bust. So from that point also, I'm going to outline that ½ inch and I'm going to place my French curve and I'm going to draw out my neckline. So after drawing it, I'm just going to go ahead to place my French curve this way and I'm going to connect to the upper part. So I'm done with this part of the cup. We'll be moving over to this side. So at that 1 inch dart intake, I'm just going to go in and connect. So to draw my cup for the other side, I'm going to place and remark my bust circumference divided by 2. So whatever I have between my chest line and my bust circumference, I'm going to divide it into 2. From there, I'm just going to place my French curve and connect it to the other part. Then I'll go ahead and place my French curve, touching that point at the chest line and my under bust. So I'm done with this part of the cup. Next is to insert my body circumference. At the bust, I'm going to mark my bust circumference divided by 4, and I'm going to mark my 1.5 inch sewing allowance, and I'll go ahead to measure what I have here. So I'm also going to replace it. Going down to my under bust, I'm going to measure my under bust circumference divided by 4, and I'm going to mark the dart intake, and I'll mark the 1.5 inch sewing allowance. Going to the waistline, I'm going to mark my waist circumference divided by 4, mark the dart intake, and I'm going to go ahead to mark 1.5 inch sewing allowance. So next, I'm just going to take what I have at the bust to the chest line, and I'm going to connect from the bust down to the under bust and down to my waistline. Then I'm just going to use my marker, and I'll go ahead to outline the necessary parts of the pattern. Next, I'm just going to label my cup as A1 and A2, and going to number the center as CF, center, front and side. So what I'll do is just to cut out my pattern. So at this point, if you find this tutorial very interesting and educative, please hit on the subscribe button if you haven't yet subscribed. So this is my pattern after I'm done cutting out, and this is what it looks like. Moving over to the back, I went ahead to cut out my zipper allowance. So we'll not be doing much for the back. I just marked one each zipper allowance. So what I'm going to do, this is like the easiest method to draft the back part of your corset. I'm just going to trace what I have in front, and I'm going to mark it at the back. So next, I'll be taping this together. After taping it together, I'm just going to place it on the pattern paper for the back, and I'm going to go ahead to cut it out exactly the measurements I have. So after cutting it out, I'm just going to go ahead to unpin it, and my back pattern is ready. This is what I have for my back pattern, and I'll go ahead to label it as back. Next is to get rid of the bulginess at the back, and I'll go ahead to mark ½ inch. After marking ½ inch, I'm just going to place my my ruler, and I'm going to connect it to the upper part of my pattern. After connecting the line, I'll go ahead to cut it out. So this is my front and back pattern, and we'll be moving over to cut the lower part of the dress. So for the lower part of the dress, they're in two sections, the basque side and the ruffle side. So I don't need much pattern paper for the down part. So first, I went ahead to mark my waist, and then marked 7 inches to get my hip point. And remember that we stopped at my shoulder to waist, so I'm going to place my tape at my waist, which is 17. So afterwards, you're just going to mark 7 inches or 8 inches to get your hip line. So next, you're going to determine the length of your dress and the ruffle length that you want. So without much wasting time, I'm just going to place my tape at the waistline, and I'm going to mark my waist circumference divided by 4, and I'm going to mark my 1.5 inch sewing allowance. So after marking that, I'm going to go down to my hip point. But before doing that, you notice that the ruffle started above the hip, so you'll be going up by 2 inches. So I'm going to place my tape, and I'm going to mark 2 inches above my hip line. After marking that, you're going to go over to your hip, and you're going to mark your hip circumference divided by 4. So I'm going to place my tape, and I will mark, and then mark my 1.5 inch sewing allowance, which ends at the end of the pattern paper. I'm going to place my French curve, and I'm going to go ahead to connect from my waistline down to my hip point. Then I'll go ahead to outline with my marker. Now we are going to draw out the basque area of this skirt. So for a much taller person, you can go ahead to use about 13 inches. But if you're on the short side, you can go ahead to use from 10 to 11 inches. And also bear in mind that the length of your basque can also determine or affect the length of your dress. So my shoulder to waist is 17 and my basque length I'm using is 11. So 17 plus 11, I have 28 inches. So for the length of my ruffle, I'll be using 9 inches. So with that, the total length of my gown is 37 inches. So you have to bear in mind all this, where you want your basque to stop, where you want your ruffle to stop, before you can go ahead to draft your skirt pattern. And if you don't want the upper part of your basque to start above your hip line, you can go ahead to mark it at your hip line. So the first illustration I'm going to do, I'll go ahead to mark my basque length, and then I'm going to connect it to the hip for those that don't want theirs to start from the hip. But from what we have at the thumbnail, it started at the 2 inches or above the hip line. So I'll just go ahead to connect it down to my basque length, which is 11 inches from my waistline. But before that, I'll go in by 1.5 inches, which is my sewing allowance. So after marking it out, I'm just going to use my marker to outline it, and I'm going to draw a straight line indicating the basque length in case you're confused. And I will go ahead also to cut out this first for those that want theirs to start at the hip, and then later I'm going to recut it for those that want their own to start above the hip line. So after cutting this out, we'll be moving over to cut the other one in case yours want to start above the hip, just like the one we have at the thumbnail that started 2 inches or above the hip. So what I'm going to do right now is to place my ruler from that 2 inches above the hip that we marked earlier, and I'm going to go ahead to connect. So this is exactly what we have on the thumbnail. So after doing this, I'm going to cut out, and the front pattern is ready. So after cutting this, I went ahead to add 1 inch for the zipper. So if I want to cut out the back, I'll just unfold it this way, and if I want to cut the front, I'll fold it back. I'll be cutting the ruffle part in our next video, so please join us in our next video where we'll be sewing this particular dress. Thank you, and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't.